65 days. This specific time frame stands at the heart of the current Nancy Guthrie missing person inquiry. For those who have tracked this mystery from its inception, the gravity of this duration is already clear. It has been 65 days since a resident of Tucson, Arizona, mysteriously vanished from the safety of her own residence. 2 months have passed since a motion-sensing camera captured images of what detectives now characterize as a deceptive exit. 65 days without clarity. Yet, some concrete facts have finally emerged this evening. Our goal isn't to revisit old news you likely already know. Instead, we are focusing on a major development. Federal investigators have verified that DNA samples found at Nancy Guthrie's house do not match her profile. Furthermore, the samples do not belong to anyone in her immediate social circle. A search of the National Criminal DNA Database, which contains profiles for over 20 million individuals with prior convictions, yielded 0 results. Despite this finding, no suspects have been detained or officially accused. What is the current status of the probe? What is happening with those biological samples? Why has the most significant piece of forensic data, which is currently being analyzed in a federal lab, failed to produce a lead after 65 days? Tonight, we are tackling that issue head-on using facts rather than rumors. We are joined by a specialist who has cracked over 300 cold cases using the very techniques being utilized on the DNA in Nancy's case. C.C. Moore, the lead genetic genealogist at Parabon Nanolabs, spoke with TMZ to provide the most thorough public breakdown to date regarding the lack of progress. Her insights are incredibly precise. She has direct experience with the data, and the information revealed toward the conclusion of this report will reshape your entire perspective on the investigation. Stay tuned as we analyze the current state of the hunt. This is where the search stands as of today. Nancy Guthrie, an 84-year-old woman and mother to Today Show host Savannah Guthrie, went missing in February 2026 from her Tucson home. What started as a simple welfare check by local authorities quickly transformed into a high-stakes criminal probe. The level of resources being utilized is far beyond a standard missing persons report. This is now a federal matter. Multiple agencies are collaborating, and the sheer volume of personnel involved shows just how serious investigators are taking this. Official records from the Pima County Sheriff's Department confirm several key details. Foreign DNA was indeed found inside the residence. It does not belong to Nancy, nor does it match anyone she knew personally. The national database shows no hits, and federal authorities currently possess the samples. The Sheriff's Department has been very careful about what they keep secret, specifically refusing to disclose where the DNA was found, how much was collected, or if they have a timeline for when it was left there. This calculated secrecy actually tells us a lot. Usually, when detectives are talkative, it means they have something they want the public to see. When law enforcement stays quiet, it typically suggests they are following a live evidentiary trail. Sheriff Chris Nanos has dealt with significant heat throughout this process. This channel has previously explored that criticism, specifically regarding his conflicting public comments and the initial management of physical evidence. We aren't going to rehash those old arguments tonight. Instead, we are looking at the current state of the forensic evidence. The material exists and is being tested, but the results are not coming back quickly. Our objective tonight is to explain the delay. Before we look at the science, consider one more detail. Ashley Banfield's podcast, Drop Dead Serious, has provided consistent updates by relying on anonymous insiders within the department. Based on those confidential sources, Banfield reported that the DNA profile at the scene is considered complicated. That specific word is where C.C. Moore begins her explanation of what the evidence really looks like. When local authorities announced there was no database match for the DNA in Nancy's home, many followers of the case assumed the trail had gone cold. That assumption is incorrect. However, to understand why, one must grasp what the national database actually does and what its limitations are. The Federal Bureau of Investigation manages the Combined DNA Index System, commonly known as CODIS. This system stores genetic information for more than 20 million people, mostly those with criminal records or specific arrests. If a suspect's profile is already registered in this federal system, a match can be identified almost instantly. Everything hinges on that single condition. C. The federal tracking system restricts its records to individuals with prior criminal history, or those formally processed during a police investigation. It excludes the general public entirely. It excludes people with clean records. and doesn't have access to the millions of citizens who used commercial services like Ancestry or 23andMe. Consequently, failing to find a hit suggests a couple of potential scenarios. Perhaps the individual linked to the evidence at the resident's home lacks any record of serious legal trouble within the country, or, alternatively, and this remains the scenario that laboratory researchers find much more plausible, the evidence gathered from the scene represents what specialists categorize as a complicated genetic blend. Essentially, this term describes exactly what you would imagine. Rather than finding DNA from just one person, detectives are dealing with traces belonging to several different individuals all mingled together on a single surface or swab. Such findings are quite common in field investigations. Biological traces pile up on everything we touch, like entryway handles, wall switches, or stair handrails. These high-touch areas naturally accumulate the genetic signatures of every person who has come into contact with them. Dealing with a two-person blend is relatively straightforward for most modern labs. They have specific software designed to separate two distinct contributors. However, the evidence from the Guthrie residence, according to C.C. Moore's Inside Information, is much more difficult to untangle. This isn't a simple two-person sample. It is a highly cluttered mixture with 3 or more people involved, where the suspect's DNA might only make up 10% of the total sample. If a lab finds 4 unknown men in a sample, and each only represents 5 or 10%, it is very unlikely to provide the breakthrough needed. Consider the difficulty of that situation. Out of every 10 pieces of genetic data in that swab, 9 of them probably belong to people who had a legitimate reason to be in the house. This includes Nancy, her family, guests, or workers, while only one small part belongs to the intruder. Within this specific investigative field, researchers face a massive hurdle when using software-based tools to pull that 10% of DNA from an unidentified contributor out of the existing dataset. Another layer of complexity exists because it's not just about whether detectives can actually pull a lone suspect's signature out of that biological soup. Investigators must determine if they can create the specific type of genetic map required for genealogical research. Those are 2 very different technical challenges. When discussing the science of DNA, one particular expert stands out above all others. That person is C.C. Moore. She serves as the head of genetic genealogy at Parabon Nanolabs, which is the top firm in this field across the country. If you follow true crime documentaries or news, you have almost certainly seen her work in action over the last few years. She is famous for cracking more than 300 cold cases that lacked suspects for decades, by using genealogy on old DNA samples that were previously thought to be useless. She is the leading authority in this specific branch of forensic science, and she gave an exclusive interview to TMZ regarding the Nancy Guthrie case. Her findings were definitely not what people in the field were waiting to hear. This is a big deal not just because of her specific claims. The real story is the fact that she decided to go on the record at all. C.C. Moore isn't the type to just guess about open investigations without proof. When she explains why the DNA hasn't identified a suspect, she is talking about a hurdle she knows intimately. Here is the heart of her statement to TMZ. The evidence found at that house isn't a clean, single profile. It's a messy, multi-person blend. The trouble with these complex blends, especially when using family trees instead of standard DNA matching, is that the entire scientific approach has to change. This looks like a multi-contributor mixture, meaning more than 2 people are involved, and likely several of them remain unidentified. Standardized forensic DNA testing, typically for national database comparisons, depends on short tandem repeat markers known as STR profiles. These universal genetic benchmarks essentially function as a biological ID card for law enforcement. Most labs are quite comfortable with messy samples because that software and technology have been perfected over the last few decades. Even when samples are messy, expert technicians can usually isolate the DNA signature of the person who left the smallest trace, then compare those results against federal records. Genetic genealogy is a different game. It doesn't use those standard markers. It relies on single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs. A SNP profile needs hundreds of thousands of genetic data points across a person's entire genome. It provides a much more detailed and information-heavy map. That level of detail and massive data volume is exactly why modern family tree research is so effective. Uploading a genetic map to a public site isn't simply checking for a single direct hit. You are asking the system to find every individual who shares significant portions of that person's specific genetic code. It finds parents, siblings, or even distant cousins. The system maps out a family tree from those links, letting detectives work backward to find the suspect. CC Moore points out a major hurdle, though. We have ways to digitally untangle different people's DNA and STR samples, but those same unmixing techniques just aren't available for genealogical data yet. The specialized software used by laboratories to pull out a faint DNA signal from a messy STR sample has not been developed for the specific needs of ancestry-based research. There is currently no widespread way to produce a crisp genetic report for someone who only makes up 10% of a mixed sample. That technical limitation is what is currently stalling the case. It comes down to the deep science of mixed DNA. We need to look closer at the tech, because that's where the real answer is, and where the public discussion has been a bit fuzzy. To build a genomic map for ancestry purposes, crime lab experts generally rely on tools like microarray testing or what they call low-pass whole genome sequencing. Both techniques generate a list of millions of unique spots in a person's DNA. These are the single points that make every human being different from the next. That final information packet is what investigators submit to commercial sites for comparison. The core difficulty with contaminated samples is simply distinguishing the real data from background static. Imagine trying to hear a single flute in a room where 9 other instruments are playing much louder. The flute, our suspect, is physically there in that space. While the actual data is present, refining that signal well enough to piece the sequence back together is a technical challenge researchers haven't mastered for SNP samples yet. For STR testing, specialists created statistical programs such as TrueAllele and STR Mix that analyze tangled samples to determine if a specific individual is a minor contributor. Courts all over the nation have accepted these methods, securing guilty verdicts in situations where old-school forensic techniques were totally unable to provide clear answers. However, these applications were designed specifically for STR profiles using only a few markers, not the massive genomic maps required for genealogy. At the SNP level, the task of separating data is much harder. When a lab gets SNP data from a mixed sample, they get a noisy signal where every spot has DNA from everyone in the mix. At a spot where the suspect has one trait, and a more prominent person in the sample has a different one, the suspect's signal just gets buried by the stronger contributor. The final result is a SNP profile that is neither accurate nor possible to use. Genealogy sites require a clean, double-copy profile to work. A mixed profile just won't meet those quality requirements. This isn't a mistake by the police, the FBI, or the testing lab. It is a gap in our current technology. Today's tools weren't made for this exact scenario. Standard forensics and genealogy grew up on separate paths. The place where those two fields meet, applying genealogy to messy crime scene samples, is the absolute bleeding edge. And that edge is still being built. What Moore is highlighting is a massive technical obstacle that the forensic science community is finally starting to tackle. This particular hurdle isn't exactly a new problem. The real difference here is the massive public interest and financial backing, which are forcing developers to get this software ready much faster than they normally would. Now, this is where the story gets very specific, and I am going to be very careful with our sources here because accuracy is everything. Moore told TMZ that people close to the case confirmed engineers are rushing out new software specifically to deal with the unique challenges found in the Nancy Guthrie investigation. She named a potential company behind this work called Estra. They are supposedly building a software package to untangle these complex mixtures. I have even heard that specialized equipment is slated for release in about 1 year to help with these issues, which is an incredibly rare and rapid development. Let us be clear that this is CC Moore's info from her own sources. We aren't independently confirming the Estra claim ourselves. We are just relaying what she said to TMZ. Even so, her main point about creating software to untangle complex DNA mixtures for genealogical research aligns with the exact goals scientists have been chasing for several years. The gap between old-school DNA mixing and new SNP genealogy is a well-known problem in scientific circles. Many research teams, both in the government and in the private sector, have been racing to find a fix for this. What CC Moore did was put a name and a deadline on that race. She gave us a company, a case, and a real sense of urgency. If her sources are right, and she has no reason to lie considering her career is on the line, then the Nancy Guthrie case is not just using current tools. It is building new ones. Think about the weight of that. A missing 84-year-old woman from Tucson is creating so much scientific pressure that private companies are rushing to invent tech that doesn't exist yet. It is no coincidence that the forensic world is so deeply invested in this specific matter. This shows exactly who is watching and who is pushing for results. As CC Moore predicts, the software will not be functional for months or even a full year. We are not looking at a scenario where a simple update solves everything by next week. However, a clear trajectory is forming, with experts diligently constructing the very infrastructure that will lead detectives to their goal. This detail is crucial for our current perspective on the probe. The idea that detectives are just stalling or ignoring proof is completely false. We are looking at a literal sprint. It's a competition between a mystery hidden in a blended specimen and researchers rushing to develop the right tool. Just because we lack the necessary tool today does not imply the lock will remain closed forever. At this stage, progress depends on lab experts and geneticists rather than lawyers, while the FBI maintains a force far more sophisticated than a simple standalone genealogy squad. Their advanced forensic operations are run by the DNA analysis branch of the FBI lab, working alongside an investigative genealogy department founded back in 2019. The entire purpose of this initiative is to integrate cutting-edge genetic mapping into federal law enforcement efforts. We aim to adapt the commercial data linkage breakthroughs, spearheaded by CC Moore and her peers, for use in official government criminal investigations. Moore informed TMZ that federal agents are prepared to go into overdrive the second they can pull a usable genetic snapshot from Nancy Guthrie's file. The FBI's genealogy unit is fully prepped for this move. Once that usable genetic signature is found, they'll be on it around the clock. This isn't just hope, it's a statement about their tactical status. A specialized group with the authority and resources is simply waiting for science to catch up with the requirements of the case. Understanding the rules for the upcoming steps is vital. Federal agents cannot just browse public DNA records freely. People often forget this nuance when debating family tree forensics. Sites like Ancestry or 23andMe follow strict internal guidelines and privacy rules, sometimes specifically blocking police from viewing their data. As of now, only two primary services, Family Tree DNA and GED Match, permit police to submit data under specific guidelines. Since 2020, the Department of Justice has regulated how federal agencies utilize genetic tracing through a set of temporary protocols. Under these rules, agencies can only deploy such methods for brutal felonies or cold cases involving unknown bodies, provided they have sign-off from superiors. They must also keep detailed logs of all leads and only interact with platforms that have clear, pre-approved rules for law enforcement. Nancy Guthrie's murder is a serious felony case that fits all federal criteria for DNA tracing. The only missing piece is that specific genetic map needed to start the whole engine. That is the only holdup. This obstacle is purely a scientific one, rather than a lack of police effort or legal power. Currently, the situation involves a prepared FBI squad and a supportive legal environment. There are millions of genetic profiles available for searching, while the killer's DNA sits in a lab, trapped in a messy sample, awaiting code that might take some time to finish. This is the reality of the situation, shaped entirely by the current limits of scientific technology. Let's discuss the next steps once that breakthrough occurs. CC Moore's recent public comments provided a major update for this case. The big number is 50 million profiles. Yes, 50 million. Moore highlighted that massive figure when explaining how much data agents could leverage once they pull a clean genetic marker from the evidence found at the crime scene. Even with 50 million individuals tested, the top 3 DNA firms have officially banned authorities from digging through their archives for investigations. There are 50 million biological records stored nationwide, mostly from folks who just wanted to trace their family roots using a simple kit. These users were looking for medical insights or searching for relatives. Not a single one signed up to assist in a criminal manhunt. Hardly anyone realizes that through valid legal warrants and specialized forensics, their biological profile, specifically the family ties it exposes, can actually pinpoint an individual who hasn't ever provided a DNA test themselves to any database. This concept drives modern forensic genealogy, and we should take a beat here because the general public usually has a pretty fuzzy grasp of it. When police submit a genetic snapshot, Their goal isn't to find the killer's name in the system immediately. Instead, they are searching for family members who share significant portions of their genetic code with the unidentified perpetrator. Anyone from a brother to a far-removed cousin can become a lead if their shared biological markers are strong enough. After finding those connections, experts like Moore begin constructing elaborate family trees to bridge the gap between the match and the suspect. The strategy involves finding a shared relative between the user and the killer, then tracing that lineage down to find a person who fits the right demographics. Detectives then filter those names through locations and records, a method that became famous during the 2018 arrest of the Golden State Killer. The Golden State Killer was caught using a distant relative's info on GED Match. His own profile was missing from any police files. He had dodged official databases completely. However, his family members, who knew nothing of his dark secrets, were on public sites. That provided the necessary link. According to Moore, if they can successfully clean up the Guthrie evidence and get a clear reading, the FBI will get court orders for those massive private databases. If they get that access, the clock on catching him won't be measured in years or even months. This is precisely why I suspect that obtaining a functional DNA record for the public ancestry platforms will result in legal subpoenas for the tech giants to catch him much faster than before. So, identifying the suspect could happen within moments or days rather than over many years. From mere minutes to a week, that is where the shift occurs. The full inquiry, including all media briefings, ground searches, tip calls, and crime scene teams sent to Arizona, eventually converges on one pivotal lab breakthrough. Everything depends on the exact second they can finally pull a pure genetic marker from that tangled biological mess. This specific point marks the difference between 65 days of silence and a breakthrough that could occur faster than renewing a standard passport. The systems are ready, the team is waiting, the records are fully integrated. The statutory framework is already in place. We are simply missing the specific bridge that allows biological evidence to finally speak. That is where we conclude for this evening. Since there is no clean resolution to an investigation that remains open, we cannot offer one. There is only transparency regarding the current status and honesty about the effort required to advance. The genetic material recovered from the Guthrie residence is authentic. It has been verified. Federal investigators currently have it in their possession. According to the most qualified experts available, the lack of an arrest does not stem from a failure of the investigation. Instead, it is the result of a technological hurdle never encountered in this exact way. We are looking at a tangled genetic blend with a minor profile at roughly 10% within a forensic industry that sees the destination but is still paving the road to reach it. By coming forward and putting her reputation behind the explanation, Cece Moore gave this community a rare gift in an active case. She provided a candid account of the logic, not just the facts. It explains why 65 days have passed without anyone being taken into custody. It clarifies why the physical proof exists even though the file has not yet moved forward. This explains why the resolution will feel so sudden after years of waiting. We are currently tracking whether that new software gets finished ahead of schedule. We also need to see if other methods work first, or if detectives have different leads that might solve things sooner. Genetic material is just one part of the puzzle. While the DNA gets the most attention, other factors matter. If you have any credible information or missed details about this case, please share them below. This group has been great at finding useful clues. We review every single comment and track every discussion. Nancy Guthrie has been missing for 65 days. This remains a very active investigation. The proof is there, and tech is advancing. See you soon. This report was made for educational and news purposes, using public files and official media statements. No specific individual has been identified as a suspect in Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. The analytical points made in this video are our own editorial views on the facts, and are noted as such. Information from single sources is presented with the necessary caveats. This channel never fabricates data, speculates about individuals without a verified basis, or creates content to damage any person's reputation. If you have legitimate information regarding this case, reach out to the Pima County Sheriff's Department tip line at 520-351-49. For support, call 988. This story leaves us with a lesson that is both painful and deeply human. Truth does not always arrive quickly, and justice is not always delayed because people do not care. Sometimes, it is delayed because reality is more complicated than our expectations. In a world shaped by instant answers, fast headlines, and constant noise, cases like this remind us that real investigations are not movies. They are slow, fragile, exhausting, and often filled with uncertainty. When a loved one disappears, every day feels unbearable. 65 days is not just a number. It is 65 mornings of hope, 65 nights of fear, and 65 days of living with questions no family should ever have to carry. That alone should teach us compassion. One of the strongest messages in this story is that silence does not always mean failure. From the outside, people often assume that if there is no arrest, no dramatic press conference, and no public breakthrough, then nothing is happening. But this case shows the opposite. Sometimes investigators are not inactive. Sometimes they are facing the limits of science itself. Sometimes the truth exists in front of them. But the tools needed to unlock it are still being built. That is a humbling thought. This also teaches us to respect facts more than rumors. In emotionally charged cases, speculation spreads fast. People want someone to blame. They want a villain, a quick answer, a neat ending. But responsible thinking requires discipline. It asks us to slow down, separate evidence from assumption, and remember that careless accusations can wound innocent people while distracting from the real search for truth. Integrity matters most when emotions are high. Another powerful lesson is the value of persistence. The story makes clear that even when a path seems blocked, that does not mean the road ends there. Scientists, analysts, and investigators keep working. New methods are developed. Old evidence can become new evidence when technology evolves. What looks impossible today may become solvable tomorrow. That is a message of hope not only for criminal investigations, but for life itself. Many of our hardest battles are not won because the pain disappears. They are won because people refuse to stop. Finally, this story reminds us that every case is about a human being, not just evidence. Behind every lab sample, every report, every headline, there is a missing woman, a grieving family, and a community waiting for answers. We should never become so fascinated by the mystery that we forget the person at the center of it. The deeper educational value here is clear. Be patient with truth. Be careful with judgment. Trust evidence over noise. And never underestimate the power of persistence. Justice may move slowly, but when people remain honest, disciplined, and determined, even the most buried truth still has a chance to speak.